words that simply say, you are an unceasing spiritual being with an eternal destiny in God's great universe.
So about 33 years ago, in a couple of days, our first child was born. And I had the most striking, unexpected experience in that moment of having a sense of the entire range of her life. And I said to my wife, it's so remarkable to me that this tiny little blob that I'm holding right now is going to grow up into an adult and then grow old. And this perfectly pink, smooth skin that I'm holding will get wrinkled and mottled. And she had a little strip of red hair. This red hair will turn gray and then white. And then we will grow old and die, and then she will grow old and die. This little child I'm holding right now. And Nancy said, let me hold her, you're creeping her out. But the wonder and the questions that moment evokes, although I did not know how to formulate them like this then, what is real? What is the good life? Who is a good person? How do you become a good person? Have always seemed by far the most important questions to grapple with. And that's part of why I ended up pursuing a degree in clinical psychology with my friend Gary. And I thought I would end up doing therapy with people to help them wrestle with these questions, but it turned out I was really bad at doing therapy. People would see me and get worse. And I hated doing therapy. I thought if I have to do this the rest of my life, I'll slip my wrists, and that's not a good approach clinically. And at the same time, I started to preach the gospel, and I felt more alive than I have ever felt before, and so I thought, I think this is what I am called to do. But then I made another discovery that I had a hard time helping people enter into the kind of transformation that it seemed that the gospel ought to be about. And even worse, I had a hard time entering into that myself. And I remember reading The Celebration of Discipline when it came out 40 years ago. And I did not like it when I first read it, because I felt like I already feel guilty about not reading the Bible and praying enough, and now I'm supposed to feel guilty about 10 more things that I'm not doing. And then one day, somebody recommended this book, The Spirit of the Disciplines. And I remember reading in the preface the claim that the great challenge facing the church, the great problem is that we have failed to take transformation as seriously as do modern revolutionary movements. And I thought, that's true. And then the thesis of the book, that authentic transformation is possible if we're willing to do one thing, and that is to arrange our lives around those practices and activities in which Jesus engaged, to be constantly at home with and receiving power from his Father. And now that's union, that's transforming union. There are, I know, many, many dimensions to union, but I take it that at its core, it is a personal reality. And it is an experience. Intimacy is shared experience. And so I began to read everything I could by this man, Dallas Willard, and listen to his tapes over and over and over again. And then that led to other people, other voices. And what I began to learn was my great problem wasn't so much what I didn't know, it was the things I thought I knew that were just slightly off. I remember one day hearing Dallas ask the question, what is the gospel that Jesus preached? And now maybe that got talked about quite a lot in the church where I grew up, but I had been through church and through seminary, and when I first heard that, it gets talked about more, I think, now. But when I first heard that, I did not know what the answer to that was. I grew up believing that the gospel essentially was the announcement of the minimal entrance requirements for getting into heaven when you die. But the problem is, nobody was asking me what those are. California is a place with a lot of very unchurched people, and I remember being on a flight one time with a guy who was clearly very unchurched, and we had a long conversation. He was quite engaged, and after about an hour, he asked me, what do you do for a living? That's always an interesting question when you do what some of us do. And I said, I'm a pastor. His immediate response was, well, I'll be damned. And I thought, well, I have a prayer that can take care of that, so that's not a problem, see. But of course, the idea that Jesus' gospel was something much deeper and richer, that the kingdom of God, the range of God's effective will, the sphere in which all is as God wants it to be, with the families of reptiles and mammals and human beings, is now available supremely through the person and work of Jesus, through his sacrificial love expressed most fully in his death on the cross and then sealed by the great power of the resurrection. And if you want to, you can enter into it now. Eternity is already in session. And I wanted that more than I'd ever want anything else. And then Dallas would say, now if you do want that, the way that you enter into it is by trusting Jesus. Now that was another problem for me, because I grew up believing trusting Jesus meant that you trust that he made an arrangement for you to get into heaven when you die, and that as long as you trust him about that, you don't actually have to trust him about anything else. So all of these words were problems for me. He said, if you do my will, you will know my teaching is from my Father. In other words, if you obey, you will come to believe. I grew up thinking that as long as you believed, you didn't have to obey. And Michael Novak talks about 3 different levels of belief. And the third one is what is required for a transforming union with God. There is those beliefs that we profess because we want other people to think we believe them, whether we do or not. Do these pants make my hips look big? No, your hips are hardly visible. There are those beliefs that we think that we believe, although it may turn out that we actually do not, because that's a kind of a feeling of certainty. And then there is what Dallas used to talk about as the mental map, your mental map about how things are. And you never violate that. You live at the mercy of that. But often you don't know what it is that is a part of your mental map until there is a moment of crisis. I believe in gravity. I don't have to get up and say, today I'm going to show people how committed I am. It's just part of my mental map, so I don't violate it. A couple weeks ago, the team at the church where I serve thought it would be a cool thing if I were to illustrate a sermon that I was preaching about trust by jumping out of a plane. And so they signed me up for that. It's a true story. And so they don't care about me a whole lot, but they're real committed to sermons. And so I went to Watsonville, and they explained to me how parachutes work and how well packed they are and straps. And I believed this parachute will work. And then I got into the plane, and we were 14,000 feet above the earth, and the door opened. And I discovered parts of my body did not believe that this was a perfectly safe place for me to be. My armpits didn't believe it. The palms of my hands did not believe it. Dallas used to say sometimes that one of the ways of thinking about spiritual formation is that you come to believe with your whole body what you say you believe, or even think you believe with your mind, because the will is transformed by experience, not information. And that is the way it is for embodied people who outsource most of our lives to our habits, to what Paul called our members, that is, our bodies. And often it is not until a moment of crisis that we discover, what is it in my mental map? And saving faith is not what's the minimum amount you have to believe such that if you believe it, they have to let you into heaven. That is not saving faith. But that's what I grew up thinking saving faith is. Saving faith is when my mental map begins to look like Jesus' mental map. When I become united with him in that, so that I start saying the kind of things that he would say and seeing the kind of things that he would see, and it flows out of me. And often it's not till a moment of crisis. We had 3 little blobs, and they all grew up. And as every family does, we have had moments of wonderful joy and moments of great anguish. And a number of years ago was a season that was very difficult, and it involved our little blobs, and it put a strain on my marriage with Nancy. And it was a very hard, better part of a year. and I was on antidepressants, and I was not actively suicidal, but I remember very often thinking if my life would end tomorrow, I'd be fine with that because it just hurts. And I told a few people what was going on, and their response would be, "That's really hard. We will pray for you." And then I thought, I must tell Dallas about this. I thought, I must tell him. And I called him up, and I walked through with him what was going on in my life and how much it hurt. And he did not say, "That must be hard." He did not say, "I will pray for you." There was a long pause. With Dallas, there was always a long pause. And then he said, "This will be a test of your joyful confidence in God." And my first thought was, well, let's test your joyful confidence in God. Who else would say that? But of course, his joyful confidence in God had been tested a long time ago, and he was exactly right. And I have thought that thought 10,000 times. Because if there is the kind of God and Father of Jesus who Jesus described, I can with joyful confidence put my life and the life of my little blobs into his hand. And if there is not a God and Father like that, I got way bigger problems than those 3 little blobs. And so union with him is experienced in no other way but obedience to him, the surrender of the will expressed in a life arranged around Jesus' activities and practices and rhythms, so that I might receive from one moment to the other power from him to be with him and live like him. And one of the most beautiful pictures of this, used by C.S. Lewis and many, many others, is this image of a dance as a picture of union, the union of persons, of beauty and joy and submission. I married a California girl. I did not grow up dancing. I grew up Midwest Scandinavian Baptist. My people were not a dancing people, but my wife was, and she decided she wanted to take dance lessons together. And so some time ago we did, and we got a little book that tells you how to dance and has diagrams about where your feet are supposed to go. I can waltz now. Would you like to see me waltz? It's correct. I know the book. I can do the book, but it lacks grace. And I began to dance with Nancy, and a little bit of her grace began to spill over into me. And it wasn't just knowing the book and doing the book. There was grace to it. And at the foundation of that union, at the heart of the dance, is the surrender of the will. It's interesting, Roy Baumeister in our day is doing a lot of research around the will. The will's a tiny little thing. It's absolutely indispensable core to who you are, but of course very, very limited. The vast majority of our lives gets outsourced beyond the will. And that's why so much self-help literature is not helpful about changing a life, let alone about union with God. The will can be used to persist. It can be used to solve problems. It can be used to do impression management, but it gets worn out very quickly. The one thing the will can do and do and do is surrender. And I remember an image, Richard, that you talked about many years ago of the surrender of the will, and it's an old commercial for Lipton iced tea. Anybody remember? Or Nestea, was it Nestea? Take the Nestea plunge? And a guy would be at a swimming pool and then just fall back into the pool. And that's a picture of the surrender of the will. And Dallas used to say, the will is made for surrender. It's very interesting. Everything else that the will does exhausts it very quickly. Baumeister says it's very much like a muscle in that way. It can be strengthened over time, very quickly exhausted. The one thing the will can do on and on and on and on is it can surrender. And you can do that right now. Thy will be done. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth starting in this little kingdom, which is my blob, which is where it is possible for my will to reign. That's what's so amazing when a little blob is born and it begins to learn to walk or begins to learn to talk. We are watching a piece of matter come under the reign of a personal will. My wife and I began to dance, and the fellow who owned the studio, who was instructing us, pulled us aside and he said, "There's a problem." And I knew I would be. I'm a terrible dancer. Only it turns out it was not me that was the problem. It was my wife. And he said to her, "Now, Mrs. Ortberg, in a dance, somebody has to lead and somebody has to follow. So when you're dancing with your husband, this is a problem now. Who is leading?" And she gritted her teeth, because she's a very independent and stubborn person, and said, "He is." And the instructor said, "And Mrs. Ortberg, who is going to follow?" More gritted teeth, and she said, "I am." I didn't say a word, but I enjoyed it immensely. In the dance, somebody has to lead and somebody has to follow. My meat, he said, is to do the will of my Heavenly Father. See, the surrender of the will, which then gets expressed from one moment to the next in a rearranged life, which of course is how it must be for us as embodied persons. Not because we are engineering some kind of change, but because we are now living in a kingdom where grace, which is not just the forgiveness of sin, but God's power at work in me to do what I could not do on my own, is available from one moment to the next. And Dallas used to say, we think of sinners as needing grace, but actually saints need grace way more than sinners do. Saints burn grace like a 747 burns rocket fuel. In a little more than a week, my little blob, my firstborn blob, who is now all grown up, I am told, will give birth to our first grandchild. And it has been a hellish journey. Our daughter, and she writes about this a fair amount, who's this wonderful person, also wrestles about as deeply as anybody I know with anxiety. She is a Westmont grad and had a wonderful experience here at Westmont. And if you knew her, she has always been the most mature person in our family. But it's kind of like a duck where on the water everything is smooth and underneath the water there's this tremendous churn. And she married a wonderful boy that she met from Westmont. And they've been married for quite a few years. And they decided after quite a few years of marriage that they would like to have a child. And they began to try. And last year, in 1 year, they had 3 miscarriages. And then she got pregnant, but the weight, the burden has been another painful journey. And now, in about a week and 2 days, another little blob is going to arrive. And it will not be the end of her anxiety. And someday, probably, because we talk about this kind of stuff, she will come to me and say, you know, my little blob's a problem. Or my little blob is anxious. Or my little blob is scared. What should I tell him? And I will tell her, this will be a test of your joyful confidence in God.